Welcome to KnotWork Storytelling. This is the show where we untangle our myths and reweave our stories, one age-old tale at a time. I'm your host and lead storyteller, Marisa Gowdy. I'm a myth worker, a story healer, a coach for writers and creative entrepreneurs, and the author of The Sovereignty Knot, A Woman's Way to Freedom, Power, Love, and Magic. If you love what you hear and want to support the show, I'd be so grateful if you'd become a paid subscriber on Substack. In my newsletter, Myth is Medicine, you'll receive bonus content related to the stories on the show and deep dives into how mythology and folklore can help heal the individual and the collective in the present moment and beyond. There's a link in the show notes to follow Myth is Medicine on Substack, or visit mythismedicine.substack.com. Before we explore this week's story, I have a question for you. What about your stories? Whether it's a book project that wants to be birthed, deep, authentic writing to support your business, or a personal creative project you can't quite name yet, I'm here to support your process and help you get your words onto the page and into the world. I work with folks who are writing memoirs, chronicles of the spiritual journey, and books that explore healing in the imagination, even as they explore the toughest truths of life. I support entrepreneurs, especially coaches and therapists in private practice, who wish to weave their personal experiences with their professional knowledge and wisdom. Do you want to build a writing practice and develop the ideas you know you must share? I invite you to visit my brand new website, writingcoachmarisa.com, to learn more about my services and to set up a free 30-minute consultation. I would love to talk with you about your stories. Season 5, Episode 10, Language, Idea, Metaphor, Myth, Poetry and Conversation with Adam Wyeth. Our guest, Adam Wyeth, is a critically acclaimed author of 5 books published with leading Irish publisher Salmon Press. He is an associate artist of the Civic Theatre in Dublin. In 2019, he received the Kavanagh Fellowship Award. Adam's debut collection, Silent Music, was highly commended by the Foreword Poetry Prize. His second book, The Hidden World of Poetry, Unravelling Celtic Mythology in Contemporary Irish Poetry, contains poems from Ireland's leading writers, followed by essays that unpack and explore the Celtic mythological references in each work. His poetry collection, The Art of Dying, was published in 2016 and was named an Irish Times Book of the Year. Adam's plays have been performed across Ireland, as well as New York and Berlin. His latest book, About Blank, is an experimental hybrid piece mixing poetry, prose, and dramatic text. In 2020, Adam received the Arts Council Ireland Literature Project Award and was selected for the National Theatre of Ireland, the Abbey Theatre, to work on an audio production of About Blank. Adam is a member of Poetry Ireland's Writers in Schools scheme and has over 20 years of experience facilitating creative writing workshops. As well as teaching, Adam provides one-to-one mentoring sessions for writers, giving critical feedback on poems and whole manuscripts via his website, adamwyeth.com. Adam lives in Dublin, where he works as a freelance writer. For more info on Adam's work and books, visit salmonpoetry.com. Well, I am so excited to have Adam here today at KnotWork Storytelling. And as is our way on the podcast, we usually ask the story to speak for itself, and then we'll dive into the ways it all matters. But today, since Adam is a poet, we will begin with a poem. So Adam, will you read to us?
Yes, I'd love to. It's wonderful to be here. I just thought I'd begin with the first poem from my second collection called The Art of Dying. It's called Metamorphosis. And I suppose this poem is maybe a sort of gateway into some of the things I've been exploring with language and ideas around metaphor and myth, these kinds of things, and also the Jungian aspects, the depth, psychology aspects, as well as a quote just before this poem at the head of the collection, where Jung says, "Everything that lives must pass through many deaths." So yeah, and there's this idea as well, like William Burroughs said, language is a virus from outer space. So it's this idea as well that language is this malleable sort of informational creature, that languages live and reproduce themselves, much more than just sort of learning words. Anyway, this is the poem, Metamorphosis. The words are turning in on themselves and then turning into something else. They are turning over and under like birds, dipping in water, turning the reflection of trees into rings and ripples in the lake. They are asleep, and then they wake in the whiteness of the page. Black-licked words fall like leaves, littering the reflection of the day, then are released birds.
Oh, what a gorgeous place to start us. Thank you. And I just keep hearing so many other poets in my head around those ideas, words alone are certain good. And then I'm thinking around those ideas of if you have the words, you'll always find the way. And with Gates and Heaney. So I'm just hearing them immediately in what you're saying. So, oh, thank you for that kind of invocation to bringing us in, to beginning us there.
Sure.
Yeah. So with that sort of beginning invocation, is there one that you want to open into next? Now that we've kind of established we're in this world of words, I feel like I want to give us a couple poems to jump off from at the beginning.
Well, I mean, in this collection as well, I have this sequence of poems called the Talking Tree Alphabet, which kind of really comes from the Ogham, the Celtic tree alphabet. But this is like sort of my own myth making. I suppose this collection, it's called The Art of Dying, and there are many sort of deaths, like literal deaths, family deaths, and friends, kind of father figures, like three sort of father figures. One was a poet, one was sort of a deputy dad, surrogate parent, and one was my literal father, my father. So I suppose with this talking tree alphabet, it was sort of allowing the trees to talk to me, sometimes through sort of Irish mythology, but just sometimes through their own sort of what they wanted to say, So it was kind of meditating on the tree and the folklore around it a little bit, but then my own sort of myth making as well. So then again, there's another short poem in here called Pear, after the pear tree. And it goes like this. In the orchard, the son asked his father where everything in the world came from. The father plucked a pear from a branch, broke its flesh in half, and gave his son a seed, then asked him to crack it open and tell him what he saw inside. The son bit into its husk and said there was nothing there. They continued through the orchard without a word between them. So that's a poem from Talking Tree Alphabet.
Oh, that wordless mystery of creation, sort of a perfect way to come into us next, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. I adore that poem and it's beautiful. And I love the way you introduced it as this way of thinking about myth making. And I'm always playing with that idea. And I'm always struggling with that idea sometimes in terms of here we are in modern life, and so much of our myths that we've made up in the last century or so are damaging, right? And sometimes I have people come to me and say, "Oh, you help people write their own myths." I'm like, well, I help people work with ancient myths and maybe see what they reveal to them, because sometimes I wonder around how we've taken that ability to make our own myths and become maybe narcissistic. And I'm in no means applying that there, but I'm thinking about it in the general cultural sense of how you look at this idea of myth making and how we can do it intimately and beautifully for our own stories, and how when it's an asset and when it's a problem.
Yeah, well, there's two aspects. I mean, the true myth is something I think that lives inside us, and our great myths are reflections of that. They're sort of the great dream making of a people, so they still hold great power. And then we have another myth, of course, the lies perhaps we like to tell ourselves and different things. But a true myth comes from the deeper self, and I suppose I read it. See, I'm not someone who comes from the sort of fantasy genre of mythology so much. For me, the interest came first through sort of Irish mythology and then through psychology, but also then through people like Joseph Campbell. He would say, myth is metaphor, and a poem is like a mythology in miniature in many ways. So it's coming from that dynamic. And it's really important, I think, that all the gods and goddesses, these entities, they're all beings that live in, they come from our psyche, they come out of us, from our psyche. So it's that depth I'm coming from. And I think, mythology is always, it gets mixed up, doesn't it, between a sort of stories we like to tell ourselves. But it's where, with mythology, in its sort of true sense, in its depth sense, in its psychological sense, is that it tells you something about yourself, a bit like a dream tells you something about yourself, and it's beyond your ego identity. So it's different to a sort of a story you might like to tell other people about yourself at a dinner party to make yourself look good, or whatever you might mean, that sort of thing. Mythology comes out of a greater, beyond what we sort of know with our conscious mind in many ways. And that's what art, I think all art sort of delves in that direction, music that sort of plugs us into something kind of bigger and deeper. So I suppose with my own myth making, I suppose what I'm interested in is, like with my writing, I come from a very sort of instinctive place, which is normal with poetry. It comes from a very instinctive area, but I'm trying to sort of deepen that, I suppose, and follow a bit like, this is where it fits in with Jung as well, with like this, or the modernist idea of sort of speed writing, stream of consciousness, of producing stuff, and then working backwards and working out what this is sort of saying, and then seeing how that connects often to a myth in many ways.
Well, continuing to what you're saying too, and that idea of how myths come from within us, knowing that you're someone who emigrated to Ireland, that myths also come from the land so much there. So I'd love to hear a little bit more of your story and sort of finding Irish mythology upon moving to Ireland, or had you sort of had an inkling about the stories before you moved over?
No, yeah, I really knew nothing at all. Don't think about Irish mythology before coming to us. So I came to Ireland 24 years ago, and I arrived in a little harbour town in County Cork called Kinsale. And I did a little creative writing course there, and one of the assignments was to interview one of the local characters. And before coming to Ireland, I'd never met a living writer or poet. And in fact, I probably assumed that at that young age, all poets, true poets, were dead, because I was reading, at that point, I was reading all the Romantics and Shakespeare and Whitman, Emily Dickinson and everything like that. So I was steeped into a much older, archaic tradition, really. And so it was only when I came to Ireland that I met living poets. And like in Kinsale, this town, for instance, there were several poets, and two of the sort of major Irish poets were Derek Mahon, who lived on one side of the hill, and Desmond O'Grady, who was probably lesser known. He was a little bit overlooked in Ireland in that, but he was a hero to like people like Seamus Heaney and Derek Mahon. He was just a slightly older generation. Went to school actually with Richard Harris, the great actor. So he's from Limerick. And so Desmond was one of these poets who went out to Paris in the 50s, met people like Beckett and Picasso, met Ezra Pound, and sort of became his secretary as amanuensis, played himself in Fellini's La Dolce Vita, did Celtic studies, was a teaching fellow at Harvard. So he had translated this Welsh epic poem called the Gododin, and he was talking about Cullen and this sort of thing. So Desmond opened this whole world. So he opened up Irish mythology for me, but he also showed, I don't come from a literary family at all, so I have no sort of, or academic family. So I was like many sort of teenagers, I suppose, I was sort of scribbling poems, which are sort of probably teenage angst kind of, influenced by, like I say, the Romantics and things like that. So writing in a very archaic style. So I had no idea so it was sort of just daydreaming that it would come out. But when I met Desmond, it was like, oh, this is a real thing, and I think if you don't have it in the family, if you don't know someone, it's very hard to imagine a life. So coming to Ireland, I was able to sort of imagine a writer's life. And Desmond was a guy who lived in a tiny little house, but he had 3 desks, and he lived very simply. He had a little microwave, which he called his microwife. But he had like a desk for his own poems, a desk for his translations, and a desk for his memoirs. And he told me that discipline, routine, and regularity were important. So I learned that from him. I realized I've strayed from the question slightly, but in that, then he opened up as well as writing. He opened up for the first time Irish mythology, and like I say, people like Cullen and stuff like that. So that was, and then I think as I was reading then more Irish poetry specifically and contemporary Irish poetry, it's just naturally like here people generally, especially in literature, they have a strong understanding of Irish mythology and that sort of thing. So it was just sort of in tandem with that it kind of my interest grew, really.
I love, you and I are of the same age, and you and I were actually bumping around the west of Ireland at exactly the same time. So I can even just flashing back to, like, of course, we didn't have phones. We wrote poetry in the margins of our notebooks at our bad secretarial jobs or whatever it was. Like, just the sense of life 25 years ago was a wee bit different.
Yeah, it was. But that first poem, I must say, that I read, Metamorphosis, I often kind of keep notes on my phone, and I actually just spoke that into my phone. So whether it's the technology of a pen and paper or a technology of a phone or whatever. I think it can, it's still the same. It comes from the same source, I think.
But in thinking about those three desks at Desmond O'Grady's, in so many ways, though, you, of course, are a poet who did so much of your work in the poetic sphere, you've also done some analysis. And I know you don't necessarily consider yourself an academic, but you have that beautiful collection of others' poetry that's really focusing on the mythological aspects. I'd love to explore kind of how you got to that project and why that felt like the right thing for you to do.
Yeah, so I wrote this book called The Hidden World of Poetry, subtitle Unravelling Celtic Mythology in Contemporary Irish Poetry. And I suppose it came two ideas, really. I suppose it was like being English myself, because this is a thing with Celtic mythology. It's so weird. Like England and Ireland are so, obviously neighbours geographically, and there's many things that are shared, but actually cultures are very different in many ways. And, Ireland wasn't Romanized, didn't go through an industrial revolution, so it did retain its Celtic identity much longer than any other country in Europe, really. But of course, the British were Celts. They had the same, the same mythologies are there, but we've by and large forgotten them. So in some ways, it was kind of me reclaiming these ancient myths, but also in a way, I wrote the book for perhaps non-Irish people. That it was like, well, here are some sort of internationally recognized, celebrated poets. There's Seamus Heaney, Ivan Boland, Elena Cullinan, Nuala O'Goneill. They're all, Derek Mahon, great poets, all in the book. But many may not see their allusions to Irish mythology. But also, I didn't want the book to. I think when we talk of Irish mythology as well, it still very much belongs in that kind of revivalist Yeatsian Lady Gregory period. And I wanted to show that young, fresh Irish poets. There's a very young poet in there, Leanne O'Sullivan, who did a whole collection on the Cailleach, the Hag of Beara, her second collection. But they were kind of this new myth making was taking place. Also, sort of how the references, the allusions, the writing about Irish mythology had changed over 100 years as well, because with Yeats, it was very much about invoking the warring aspects of the Cú Chulainn, so very masculine in many ways. And so the feminine kind of got pushed aside. And I think what we're seeing a lot more recently is these feminine aspects kind of come to the rise, and these multiple different voices and the more imaginative, unconscious elements come through. So it was threefold. It was sort of a poetry primer, so sort of unpacking a poem for people who, interested in contemporary poetry, but want to know a little bit more about it. So I was unpacking the poem in that way. And then an introduction to Irish mythology and introducing Irish poets. But so that was the idea. And the book kind of evolved. I was writing these, they were written for a local paper called the Star in West Cork. So they kind of grew out of that, really. And then I thought a book might be interesting. So that's how that happened.
I felt like I was sitting back in a classroom in the very best way, in terms of just being like, here, it's okay to not be sure what this one totally means. Let's open this one up and be with it. And poetry can often be still opaque to people. I still know people like, oh yeah, if I'm reading a novel and there's a poem in the middle, I just skip it because I don't think I'm going to understand it. And I'm sure you must have a lot of conversations with people still sort of grappling with poetry or coming out of post-school wounds.
Yeah, well, that's it. We have the school side, which kind of can be damaging because it's all about what, it's just to get to answer the exam as fast as possible, as best as possible, and like, what is it about? Quickly tell me. And that's not how you should appreciate any piece of art. It should, first of all, you should engage with it, and see what it does and play with it before you get into those dynamics. But it was very much as well about poetry requires us to slow down, to sort of take in every word. So it's totally different to how we read today, where we speed read. We're trying to get, most of the time we read an article or something, we're trying to get the information as quickly as possible, and that's it. And poetry is all about the music of the language and the layers and the architecture of the language, all those elements. So, and because you'd think poetry should be read more than any other genre because it's short. So you think, it's a perfect thing to read on a commute, but of course it's not, because it requires true focus and attention. Mm-hmm. So a very short piece is very different to how we normally read. So that was part of the book as well, to get people into what I would call sort of like deep reading. And that was what was amazing, actually, with every poem I wrote about. Like when I chose the poem to write about, I had obviously had an idea of how I would like to sort of approach this and the mythology and what things I'd like to discuss. But I'd be doing these I'd be writing the essays usually about a month longer sometimes to complete them. And with every single close reading I wrote, there was like an epiphanic moment, a kind of breakthrough where the poem would reveal itself to me. And I'd read these poems hundreds of times and been writing and thinking about them and everything. But there'd be a point of this kind of breakthrough of understanding something else in the poem that would just kind of shine through. So had I not spent those weeks writing about it, and so it showed me as well the sort of, when you spend time sort of meditating and really going deep into something, how it can reveal something that you wouldn't normally see. Yeah, and I suppose poetry is all about that, paying attention to the moment and focusing, and the value of that.
Right. And it's a radical thing, as you say, to spend a lot of time on words and marinating with them and letting them germinate within you. And, I will be
Yeah,
taking this memory with me and saying, I'm in the world of producing a podcast. I'm in the world of producing a weekly newsletter. We get into those places of, I've got to produce every week. What's lost in that speed and that
yeah.
pressure?
Yeah, no, and you're right as well. It's radical. And I've only realized that partly like writing poetry, think, well, no one reads it. It's the least read of all the genres, even though it's the most studied at school. An alien coming to Earth would be very confused. The amount we studied at school, but no one reads it in real life. Anyway,
Yeah.
but in a way, there's great power to that. The fact that
Mhm.
there's no money in poetry means, I've only realized this recently, that you can say exactly what you want to say. You've
Mm,
got no one, you think with any other sort of music, even the theatre industry, that
yeah.
it depends on money.
Mhm.
And therefore, you have certain people wanting certain kinds of things, trying to guess the next thing that's going to make money. Whereas
Right.
poetry has power because it stands outside of that. So it allows for something truly honest and human, because there's no money in it. So why would you want to say it? So it means it stands outside of all those kind of commercial elements and anything. Talk about, the wrong kind of myth, as you're talking about, so
Mhm.
that's where poetry has huge power, I think, in that way.
Yeah. I'm thinking of, is that Rita Ann Higgins' poem, Poetry Doesn't Pay, right? And she was
Yeah,
going to post off poems to the bill collectors. And that wasn't quite working out for her. But we remember her words 30 years after she wrote them.
yeah, that,
I think I've shared this with you in last you and I spoke. The way I found my way to Irish poetry is because I was seeking out the mythology. And it was the only place I could find it, short of going back to Yeats and the Celtic Revival work. It was all there in women's poetry from the 80s and 90s. It was all, if you wanted to sit there long enough to discover it, you could draw all the constellations. And all of a sudden I realized, oh, I'm writing a thesis about poetry. And I never considered myself to be a student of poetry until all of a sudden that's where I needed to be.
yeah, yeah. And that's my whole kind of thing in a way with mythology and poetry and art, is that I think all great art comes out of this mythic imagination,
Mhm. Yeah.
if you like. And I think all artists, whether it's instinctive or on purpose, are dealing with these aspects. And that's what I mean. There's no difference. These are just words, ultimately, whether we're talking about myth or depth psychology, whatever we want to call these things, or, the unconscious, the collective unconscious, it's all part of the same kind of dynamic well, which is sort of underneath everything and inside everything, and I think this is what we're all missing and what we're sort of desperate to connect to in many ways.
Mm. With that, will you bring us back to the well and bring us another poem?
Yeah, okay. What to read? So it's very hard because my last book is called About Blank. And so with this book, it's like my most experimental, because I've been writing so from plays and essays. But I'll dive in here, which is, so this idea about blank as well as a bit of a joke as well, because that was another thing as well. This, again, going back to poetry having that power, that it doesn't, what is it about? Well, it's about the experience, isn't it? But also, so it became a bit, everything has to be about something. So this was called About Blank, which was a joke title. And if you have slow internet as well, that's something that comes up sometimes, about blank. But I guess the blank here is really the unconscious, that this thing that we think is blank, the things that we don't see, this is really where all the energy resides. So I was trying to sort of tap into those elements, I suppose. So there's a bit here where I say, I've been dithering in the dark all my life, cooped up in a womb. I used to read, and these words meant something to me. Now the words shudder in a frozen monitor, stuck in the between time of a loading web page. The about blank in the chest, It's cut in the throat, a stick between stones, holding up the dearly beloved. She closes her eyes. We are all in the dark. Rivers, canals, coastlines, the whole city looking the other way. She sleeps in me as I sleep in her. I will be this city one day, and then I'll be let back into the black of her. And I should say as well that the whole book is set in Dublin as well. So it's kind of this walk through Dublin, and Dublin becomes this sort of character in the piece as well. I think as well, like if anyone knows anything about Jungian psychology, because it's full of mythology as well, like Jung, really you can look at the Divine Comedy as a myth that Jung really attached himself to. If Freud's was the Oedipus complex, the whole Oedipal aspect, then with Jung, you could attach Dante's The Divine Comedy. And one thing that comes through, of course, with that is the shadow with Carl Jung. But as you go deeper into the shadow, what it reveals is this idea of our inner divine image, which is then personified. If you identify as a man, you have the anima within you, this divine feminine, or if you're a woman, you have the animus. It's the other aspect. Carl Jung was, very ahead. Psychologically, we're all androgynous. But it's this, so you have the complex, that comes through your parents and that sort of thing, but then you have the archetype. And so I was sort of delving deeper into those ideas as well in this.
Giving such a modern Dublin, because of course, I think that those of us who've studied Irish literature, we've followed Joyce around the city of Dublin. But now you're giving us Dublin through the eyes of web pages and through this kind of real modern perspective, which I just appreciate because I realize how much poetry I read is from decades ago. So it's still it's stirring on the page. Say, oh, right, we're writing in this moment, in this century. And then we're also playing with these such old illusions when we're going into Dante. We're in that realm of that timeless realm that Jung describes.
Yeah, and that's it. And I think, I always have kind of engraved in front of my mind is 3 words Ezra Pound said, which is make it new. And I think that's the job of any artist is to make it new. But and that's probably very old fashioned for people, but I still think that really holds. And I think, but really, what is the it in make it new? Well, it's tradition. So we inherit the traditions of the culture, the psychology, the collective dreams, all the stories. But the living artist has to take that and make it new. So it's an engagement. Poetry is this long conversation basically, and you can argue and be against it and do all those things. But you have to engage, I think, in many ways with that tradition to do something different, to do something new in a way. And that is, like I said, that's the mythic imagination, and you see that, whether it's Shakespeare or Yeats or anyone, the modernists were great at widening the net of these traditions and deeper,
We have that poem, Google Earth, right? And I'm not sure how long ago you wrote that, but there's ways in which that one almost seems a little quaint. Like, oh, remember when we used to think that was so amazing and now we take it for granted?
Yeah. Yeah, that is a very old poem, Google Earth. And it's interesting as well, because a lot of my work by accident sort of refers to this technology, I suppose. And I think the internet is very interesting in what it is doing to us. And I think it's easy to see the negative side of the internet, but actually it's just amazing what these tools are doing and how it's transforming us. And I actually think it's for the good in many ways, because technology has, it is a form of connection ultimately, and it has a way of solving things in a way that perhaps we can't. And maybe in a way, a bit like the unconscious. Maybe that's what the internet is. It is like the unconscious. T.S. Eliot said, humankind cannot bear too much reality in 4 quarters, I think. But I think art can, and maybe the internet can.
Right.
And that's maybe where the art and the imagination and those elements of the internet, of AI and things like that, will actually be our golden ticket in many ways, because we can get quite stuck. And the great thing with art is that, well, like you say, like Rita Ann Higgins' poem, that she is, she wrote this poem, and it's about money and that sort of thing. But the work itself is still communicating. It will communicate beyond Rita Ann Higgins. So and that's what I mean, is that it's all technology, whether it's a notebook, or an iPad. The Book of Kells was the iPad of its time. It is technology. It all gets more and more complex, I think, as it evolves.
Mm-hmm.
So technology sort of does find its way into my work with Google Earth, with this idea of about blank in this book. Also, my first play, Hang Up, is about a guy who's getting these nuisance texts on his mobile phone, and while he's trying to hang himself. And there's this whole kind of exchange with this unknown caller, and he ends up in the end swallowing the phone, and the phone kind of speaking through him. So there is this. I am interested, I suppose, in that sort of, maybe that technology, like I say, is a kind of drug, is like and it is like the unconscious in many ways.
I remember one of my Irish studies professors once upon a time saying, Irish myth outmoderns the modern. And I think it's probably a discussion around that sense of, why has no one ever tried to make a big hit movie out of these? And he's like, it's too weird. No one can quite figure out how to capture it enough.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's some of the reasons why it's so perennially fascinating to so many of us. Right?
Yeah. Yeah, I've heard that the Irish myths are much more, particularly the early cycle, it's very feminine, it's very imaginative, and probably very psychedelic. Like you say, it's very hard to pin down.
Right.
And I think, it is interesting, isn't it, that there haven't been any films yet. But it's also where the culture's interested as well. The trouble is the culture's still very we have a very narrow idea of the myths we're telling ourselves that keep getting retold, And that's why I'm actually really excited by writing at the moment. I think has gone very interesting because it's become more diverse, and that's both through sort of exploring not just white men and white women, but people of other ethnicities, also the whole LGBTQ plus. So that's creating a whole. For me, it's like a new modernism is taking place, and so I'm really excited about art and literature and where it's kind of going in these ways, because ultimately it's breaking down these boundaries, asking bigger questions, and I think that's really important.
Because you lead some workshops and some retreats, are you noticing a change in the writers who are coming to you, a different sense of focus, a different voice? Are you seeing that in the classroom?
Yeah, I think so, actually. Yeah, I'm doing a workshop at the moment, just because it's called kind of poetry or writer's surgery, where we're kind of basically a workshop where people bring in a piece of writing and we analyze it and give feedback in a constructive, critical way. And I must say, I'm very interested by writers, particularly writers who don't go through the academic route. There's such a proliferation of creative writing programs at universities now, and that's all for the good in many ways. But in some ways, there's a narrowing, because of course you're reading all the stuff that your tutors are telling you to read, and then so everyone's ends up sounding the same. There's a sort of homogenous element to it, and I think people who come outside of that don't necessarily have that. And I'm someone who comes outside of that as well. And I think so you can read what you want to read. And there's a power to that. And so, I'm interested. So I think there are some, very interesting. I think there's some great writers out there, and there's probably greater writers who aren't publishing at the moment than the ones some of them are publishing, although there's some very good published work. But, I do often think that we never know, do we, who the sort of, in years to come, people who might be unknown now, where they might be, and the other way around as well, people who are hot today, how long that lasts. I do see a new dynamic, and I do see I'm interested in this feminine aspect in its archetypal sort of realm, and this sort of, but also politically as well, how it has, the feminine's been rejected and suppressed. Ultimately, what we're seeing is this rising, I think, of this feminine aspect. And that's what's really exciting. And that's what's causing all the backlash, I think, in the world as well. That's what people are getting so scared of, because the masculine control, Peterson idea of an antidote to chaos. It's extraordinary, But I think this idea of connecting and expanding is really what art is all about. And I know for a lot of people, this is kind of anathema, and it's all very new agey, but actually it occurs in all the great. I was just reading, there's a Canadian philosopher, Charles Taylor, is it? And he's just written a book about art and music, poetry and music specifically, as this sort of great kind of connecting force, speaking in this very sort of religious way and he's a sort of secular, philosopher in many ways, political, but so the deeper people go, you can't really ignore what this sort of what the unconscious is really about. Well, we can ignore it. We do our best to ignore it, but it comes out in other ways.
And that yearning for community and that yearning for meaning and that yearning for making that sense of meaning together, right? Because I mean, certainly there's so many ways in which, thank goodness, we're free of so many of the religious structures. That's certainly in Ireland and certain aspects in America, though we certainly have the evangelical movement. That's its own problematic force. But in so many ways, as we get freer of these old religious strictures, there is that sense of what else is here to hold us. Last month, Sandy Dunlop was on the podcast and it's kind of touching on some similar themes because he came and told his myth of Cesar. And he was really talking about knocking down that strong man mythology that she was in very many ways escaping, but also just offering a counter narrative to as she took off on her three boats with 150 women and sailed herself into a new and different story. And
Yeah.
it feels like, that narrative at the same time of recognizing, how does, as you say, poetry, music, art start to come to bring us together because we are still seeking that in a way that perhaps is more of the underground feminine than those big masculine patriarchal structures that just aren't working for us anymore.
No, yeah, that's it. Absolutely. It's to keep trusting that and go deeper into that in many ways. And I think, yeah, that's what art and music, and it takes a lot of bravery to do it because there's such sort of, I think in many ways as well, like I think it's a hard time for many people and we're so sort of overwhelmed by the media and that narrative that we're fed into. And I think what I'm seeing with people now is this real, and what I'm feeling is that real need to connect with oneself and to go further, and I think in that lies the solution in many ways, rather than just fighting against something. Sometimes fighting against something can be counterproductive in some ways. In some ways, what you do is you crystallize or focus perhaps the intention of the thing you're trying to fight, if you know what I mean. And sometimes the best thing to do is find solutions. And I think that's also very hopeful that the more we can do that, the less divided we'll be, perhaps. Yeah.
Yes, that dance between the diving within and then taking action in a way that is aligned, or I think we're always searching for that descriptive word of what kind of action to take, perhaps.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, as we get closer to the end of our time, do you want to read us another poem or two?
Yeah. Okay. I'll read this poem. This is the last poem. Yeah, well, like this book about blank is bookended with two sort of normal poems, if you know what I mean. The last poem is The Great Friend, and it's about great Sufi mystic Rumi. And I think in many ways, even though this poem kind of sits outside of the book in many ways, it kind of speaks to what the book is about, which is this sort of, going back to mythology, the sort of double birth motif, the idea we're born once through the womb, but we're born a second time through the heart. I mean, this is something else I've realized recently. You look at once you read religion symbolically, which is how you should read it, it all starts to make sense, like the virgin birth. The virgin birth is a symbolic way of talking about being born through the heart. That is what it's about. And so we see this in so much. So this is a mythology of Rumi, I guess, whether it's true or not, it fits in with so many sort of mythic ideas, but also that out of a great loss comes something much deeper as well. So yeah, this is The Great Friend. In the autumn of 1244, a young Muslim scholar of Konya met a new arrival who had been traveling throughout the Middle East. This stranger put a question to the scholar. It remains one of the great mysteries. Whatever the question, the young scholar lost his breath and fainted. When he came round, the two talked and became locked in a stream of endless dialogue. Inseparable, they spoke for days without human need, like two musicians riffing, each one taking over where the other left off in a state of pure discovery. Late one night, mid-discussion, the friend went to attend a knock at the door and didn't come back. The young scholar fell silent and vowed never to speak again unless his great friend returned. He had fallen into what is known as the deep well of meditation, the narrow tunnel of mortal contemplation. For months, not a word passed his lips. Then, on his darkest night, he looked up and let out a savage howl. As he screamed, he found a new voice forming. The next morning, he headed to the market square and began to speak. Poetry and parables poured out. You are the sky my spirit circles in. My soul is from elsewhere. He started to sway and, outstretching his arms, whirled around, spinning between food stalls, weaving teachings out of chickpeas, forming fables about burnt kebabs. A large crowd gathered. Some started to swoon and dissolve into laughter. Others moaned in ecstasy and cried. One young man began writing his every word down. The Konya scholar had lost all simile and became the thing itself, the lover, the beggar, the parched earth, the unfurling flower. He continued, turning into the small hours, his great friend returning through him, a mute moon smiling in the wings.
Oh, Adam, I love that poem. Thank you so much for sharing it with us. And it's so perfect considering that's how you closed the collection, but also in this collection, you gathered it around the Wheel of the Year. And the last holiday you mark is really at Lunasubtide, which is, we'll be releasing this episode right at the beginning of August. So it's in perfect timing. Lou's wedding day, claim time is how you describe this last section of the book.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. So do you want to just close for just a moment as we're saying farewell, just a little bit about how you sort of organize this idea? And of course, anything more, I mean, that the poem of Rumi is beautiful. And the decision to kind of call in another tradition as you're closing a poem about Dublin and with using the Celtic Wheel of the Year and a mention of Lou, and then we're calling in Rumi. There's such an interesting blend there.
I think it's all connected, and
Yeah.
it's also interesting as well, like that period, which was the 13th century when Rumi was around. Well, look, so much of our tradition actually comes from them. As we know, Islam gets a very bad rap, but actually our whole romantic poetry tradition and so many things come from Islam. But yeah, and Rumi, of course. This was, I think, but it was also, then I was thinking of the Arthurian, there's a bit of Arthurian legend with an about blank as well. And again, that whole Dante and that romantic tradition, what that true romantic ideal is about as an archetype, this idea of the divine feminine. In Faust as well, the eternal feminine that leads us on. And this is, like I say, it's an archetypal, it's an energy of connection of the unconscious, and all those realms. And I just think it was connecting to all of that. And I mean, there's a mystical quality to the book. So Irish mythology is one aspect of it, but I mean, all these myths are all connected anyway. Whether they're connected by traveling storytellers or whether it's coming from this kind of collective dream that we're all part of. So it's that, and that was the whole monomyth idea was, well, first Ulysses is all about that. Is this idea of the whole of mythology being contained in one day, in Dublin, that it's all there, not just Ulysses, but everything. And that's really where Campbell got his idea of this monomyth, the hero with 1,000 faces, which of course feeds into the Jung's theories on the collective unconscious. So yeah, so it's for me, it's all connects. Like I say, all great art, I think, comes from that.
Oh, well, Adam, thank you so much for journeying with us with this today and taking us into so many different realms and spaces. And as you say, they do all connect. So, thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you. So I was fortunate enough to find a couple of your books in the States. So luckily, we have, our listeners from around the world. And I think finding your collection, certainly, it's within the realms of possibility. I couldn't get your full library, but I could get a few. But then there's a lot of your work is captured online too, right? With the audio version of this, right? Of About Blank?
Yeah, well, actually, it came out as an audio version for Dublin Theatre Festival, but it's not. I don't think it's available at the moment. But what we are doing, we're doing an AI animation film from this audio immersive piece. So that will hopefully be out soon in the next few months. Well, we've got to sort of place it somewhere. So yeah, that's really exciting. So there's three actors doing that. and then this kind of music and sound. And then, yeah, like I say, then we're going to have this whole kind of animation of Dublin, but in this very sort of psychedelic kind of way. So, and we don't know how we'll probably release that as a sort of art installation piece or something. But I recently as well had another piece. So I've been collaborating a lot with different sort of artists, and I did a piece with a composer, David Downs, called There Will Be No Silence. And that was recently done at the National Hall in Dublin, concert hall, I should say. Yeah, and that came out. So there's two pianists and a cellist in that, and then two great actors, Aisling O'Sullivan and Owen Rowe, and that's available as an album. It's on Spotify or wherever you stream your music. But the books should be available. Yeah, I mean, I think they're all in print, apart from the first collection, and they all came out with Salmon poetry, so they should be available to order. I know there's been recently some bloody problems with ordering the books for some reason, the computer system for some reason, but they should be available through normal books, Amazon as well, and then through the Salmon also sell it through their website as well, Salmon Poetry.
Well, Adam, thank you again so much for your time, and it's just been such a pleasure to hold space with you and your words.
Thanks so much. Thanks for having me. I really enjoyed it.
Thank you for tuning in to the KnotWork Storytelling podcast. Please subscribe and review the show on your favorite podcast platform, and do share this episode with other lovers of myth and story. By the way, everyone is a lover of myth and story, even if they've forgotten. Creating this show is a labor of love, and your support will help me continue to craft and share stories through this season and beyond. Please consider becoming a subscriber to my paid newsletter, Myth is Medicine. You'll find it on Substack, and that's where all my newest writing and occasional bonus podcasts can be found. You can learn more about my writing, my book, our online creative community, The Writer's Knot, as well as how to work with me as a writing coach over at marisagowdy.com. Gratefully, I live, write, work, and record this podcast on the ancestral lands of the Munsee Lenape tribe, whose name means original people.